every so often, and I do this rarely, I will ask folks, just to ask any questions they may have. And by and large, most of the time, if people have significant questions, it relates to the book of Revelation. I had a professor in college who said if you want to get a large crowd to show up at your church and you want them to be engaged in what you're talking about, say you're going to do a study on the book of Revelation and every crazy person in 50 miles will show up. Probably some truth to that. I remember growing up as an early teenager, late 90s, early 2000s, people were really talking about these issues and these things related to the book of Revelation and end time stuff and all that kind of stuff, and it just was kind of a big to-do, and then it kind of faded a little bit, and then every now and again you'll have a resurgence of interest in this topic. And so I think it's important when we read the Bible, as we've been looking over the last few weeks at how we read the different parts of the Bible, that we read these passages well. Because if we don't read them well, if we don't read them properly, we will end up not only confused, but potentially deceiving other people. And that's what we want to do. We want to make sure that we are as honest and as careful with the biblical text as we possibly can be. And particularly on issues like this that are so debatable amongst people. And as we conclude this Bible boot camp that we've been doing, we're going to talk about the book of Revelation, but this doesn't just apply to Revelation. This applies to every passage of the Bible that falls under the category of what's known as apocalyptic literature. In fact, if you get a Bible in almost any other language, it is not called the book of Revelation, it's called the Apocalypse. Because it's a type of literature, and the book of Revelation is kind of the classic example of this, but you have places in Daniel, you have places in Zechariah, you have places in the Gospels that fit into this category of what's known as apocalyptic literature. So I want us to look tonight, and we're going to zero in on the book of Revelation. We're going to look at one passage of the book of Revelation that I think is absolutely critical to understanding the entire book. Before we do that, I want to give you some preliminary guidelines for reading the book of Revelation. I've talked about some of this before in previous studies, so some of this may sound familiar, and that's a good thing. That means you are learning if you have heard some of this stuff before, and you hear it again. It's not a bad thing. So if it is a little repetitive for some of you, it's okay. I just think it's just so important that we get this framework in place, because I get asked a ton of questions. Like even today, I was doing the chapel at JDA, and every now and again, I'll just open it up for students to ask questions. Sometimes it's because I forget that I'm supposed to do chapel and I didn't prepare something, but today was actually intentional. I wanted to give them a chance to ask questions. And a lot of the questions were about, what happens when you die? What happens when Jesus comes back? I mean, these are first and second and third graders asking these kind of questions. I mean, this is stuff people are curious about. And so I want us to read the book of Revelation well. It's a good book. Don't avoid it. Don't do like some scholars have done over the centuries and study every other book of the Bible but throw the book of Revelation out because it's so complicated. I knew a New Testament scholar who had basically translated and studied every book of the Bible except the book of Revelation. And when asked by one of his students why he didn't, he said, I don't know what it means. You don't know what it means. Nobody knows what it means. And he said, perhaps even God doesn't know what it means, which I wouldn't go that far. But that was his kind of throwaway of the book. So how do we read the book of Revelation? So what are some issues to consider when it comes to the book of Revelation? Well, I think first of all, it's important to understand the genre of the book of Revelation. What type of literature is it? What type of writing is it? You don't read poetry the same way you read stories. You don't read song lyrics the same way you read a theological textbook. Okay, you read these things differently based upon the genre, the style of literature. The book of Revelation is a good example of that. There's a lot of symbolic language. And what is symbolic language? It's language that is not meant to be taken literally. Okay? It stands for something else. It references something else, but it is not meant to be read literally. So much of what's in the book of Revelation is symbolic. And John even tells us that in the book of Revelation. He's just saying this is what he saw. Now, if I asked all of you to go out and describe a sunset, would you literally tell every detail of how light refracts against the atmosphere and creates this marvelous spectrum of different colors? And based on the atmospheric conditions and water vapor and dust and all of that. No. You would say it's beautiful. You would use symbolic language. That's how we talk. So understand that. Understand too that this type of literature is typically written by persecuted groups to hide the true meaning of what they're saying from those who do not understand the metaphors or the symbols, the symbolic language that's being used. Let me give you an example. When I was in elementary school, we still passed notes to one another. Okay? Kids don't do that anymore. Now they text each other during class, but we still had to pass notes, okay? And we had one teacher, we did not like her. She was mean. And so we called her Dragon Lady. That's what we called her. Okay, she's dead now, so she's not going to watch this video, and I won't get a bad grade for it. So we called her Dragon Lady. And so when we were passing notes, we were afraid that she would read the note. Because that's what teachers do, right? They say you pass a note. Once you got that, then read the whole class. So we abbreviated, and we knew if we put Dragon Lady, she would know what that was. So we abbreviated, because we were learning about abbreviations, DL. So if she got the note, she would hear about how awful DL was and how much we hated DL and all this kind of stuff. She had no clue we were talking about her. It was wonderful. Until some will snitch in the class who will go unnamed, ratted us out. And we missed recess that day. Okay. And we still had a chalkboard, so we had to clean the chalkboard and dust off the eraser. So, they can't do that now. That's child abuse. So anyway, the use of that kind of symbolic language is what's going on there, because John is writing the book of Revelation from the Isle of Patmos. He's under arrest, really, by the Romans. It's a period of persecution in which he's writing to 7 churches in Asia Minor. So he's on an island, he's writing these 7 churches that are not there. We talked last week about how there was no Roman postal service. So you just had letters that you would write and you would send it to people by somebody. He would send it to these churches. Well, chances are pretty good if you're in prison and you got to get something to somebody, how are you going to send it? You're going to send it by the people that are holding you under arrest to where they're going. Somebody's got a courier going or something. Well, if you're the person under arrest, do you think they're going to read your mail? Yeah. So what are you going to do? Are you going to talk about how bad the Romans are? No, you're going to talk about the beast and the dragon and all this kind of stuff that nobody's going to understand except the people you're writing to, because they know the code. So you've got to keep that stuff in mind when you're reading this kind of literature. Metaphors are the same thing. They provide some comparison, but they're limited. Metaphors are limited to the original intent of the author. That's true for any part of the Bible. The original intent of the author matters more than your interpretation of what they're saying. Okay? What did they mean when they wrote it is basically what intent means. Okay? And we crave that kind of approach to things when it comes to other pieces of literature. Well, what did Shakespeare mean when he said, "O Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo?" We look for what did he mean. For some reason, we don't do that with the Bible a lot of times. We just kind of skip over that, like, what does it mean to me? Well, the original intent matters. And metaphors go with what they meant, but they're limited to that extent. Okay, so don't read more into the metaphors that are there. Understand there's a repetitive use and symbolic use of numbers. Okay, numbers are symbols for things, not to be taken literally perhaps, but symbolic. For instance, 7 is a perfect number. It's the number of completion. There were 7 days of creation. So, 7 is a perfect number. 12 is often a reference to the 12 tribes of Israel. And it represents the unity that's found in diversity. So when you hear the number 12 reference, it's a symbolic number. 4 is also a number of completion. Okay, 4. There's 4 directions, north, south, east, west. Funny story. Sophie's learning about this in school, and one of the tools you should do to teach kids to learn things is you give them little mnemonic devices for how to memorize north, east, south, and west. And so Kristen said, just remember, never eat soggy waffles. Okay, north, east, south, west. So I was quizzing her on the way to school, and I said, Sophie, what are the 4 directions? She said, never eat soggy waffles. I said, what does never stand for? Never. And so when we get her test back, I'm really hoping that the 4 directions on the map are not never eat soggy waffles. I'm really praying that we just didn't blow that one out of the water. So, but there's 4 seasons, and so numbers can often have that kind of symbolic reference point. Don't read too much into numbers, though. Okay, don't read more than numbers than's actually there. Because here's what can happen. You can get one of these people that, like wears a tinfoil hat and sits around in a dark room trying to figure out if every 17th letter is the letter, it spells out some weird code. I mean, you can really go off the deep end with this. Just understand, it's symbolic. It meant something back then, and it means something now. Okay, so the genre is important. Next, you need to know the theological context. And I include under this the use of the Old Testament. One of the things that is often ignored with the book of Revelation is that Revelation borrows heavily from the Old Testament. It doesn't directly quote the Old Testament that much, but it's dripping in allusions and references to the Old Testament. Particularly the book of Daniel and other apocalyptic literature. In fact, it has more Old Testament references and allusions than any other New Testament writing. The references are just constantly there. And if you don't have that background, which most of us don't, because guess what? We weren't raised memorizing the Old Testament like little Jewish children 2,000 years ago were. We miss that. Probably the best commentary on the book of Revelation that I can recommend. It's technical and it's about yay thick, but it's by far the best commentary on the book of Revelation is by G.K. Beale, B-E-A-L-E, and it's called Revelation. It's in the New International Greek Testament Commentary series. So if you don't know Greek, you might not be able to read it, but it's still a good commentary if you can work through the Greek. Okay? Just read hard work. Okay? But you can still read it. But it's a good commentary because it deals with a lot of... That's what his expertise is in, is combining the Old Testament references and pointing all those out and making reference to all those and figuring all that out. Okay? And so you have those theological issues. One big theme that is very similar in the book of Revelation that we tend to not pick up on is the thing of redemption, similar to the book of Exodus. One of the things that you can find a similarity with in Revelation is the fact that in the book of Exodus, when God has sent Moses back to Egypt, and God says to Moses, tell Pharaoh, let my people go, and Moses does this. Pharaoh says no, God sends plagues. If you read the story of the plagues, there are a series of those plagues that affect the Egyptians, not the Hebrews. Okay? That is so significant when it gets to the book of Revelation. Because you have God pouring out His judgment, pouring out His wrath upon the world. Thank you, I forgot. We were supposed to have a slight business meeting tonight, so don't ever forget, I will catch that up before we go to discuss about Carl. So Anyway, what happens when you cook? You just forget these things. So, now, I understand you ladies that work in the kitchen all the time. I understand why y'all might get a little frazzled. Anyway, it's so that God pours out His wrath, He pours out His judgment on the world, and yet it's almost like there's certain people that are spared. A third of the people in one reference are just wiped off the face. Well, that's not everybody. So these kind of references give you some reference point to know what's going on and why it's happening. So that theological context is important. Okay? Third, the historic situation, when it was written. Most scholars say that Revelation was written around 95 AD during a period of persecution. And here's why that's important. I cannot stress this point enough. It must have made sense to them when it was first written. Here's where I think some people make mistakes. And I'm not saying this isn't the case, but I think we risk a dangerous leap when we do this. I have heard and seen interpretations of the book of Revelation that talk about, stars falling from the earth and all this kind of stuff. Well, that's a reference to nuclear weapons, they'll say. And I just kind of scratched my head and think, I don't think that's what they're getting at, because it had to have made sense in some way to the original audience, or else they would have thought John's lost his mind, he's gone crazy. They wouldn't have kept it. They kept it because it made sense to them, it was an encouragement to them, and it helped them. Okay, so it had to have been understandable to that first audience in 95 AD. It had to have made some sense to them. Doesn't mean they understood it perfectly, just like we don't understand it perfectly. But if you have an interpretation that could not have been possible for 2,000 years, chances are pretty good you're a little off. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Just like, there's a guy, he comes on late at night, and I can't ever think of his name, but he's all the time interpreting the news in light of what he says the Bible says. And I can't tell you how many times he said somebody was the Antichrist or the beast or all that. And he's been doing this for probably 30 years. And every boogeyman on the news is a bad person in the Bible. He just makes all these. I'm like, no, you're off. You're missing it. He throws a lot of scripture out. It sounds really smart, but he's really off. So beware of those kind of things. Fourth, non-linear time. I don't have a ton of time to go into a ton of detail on this, but just understand that time in the ancient world, we have, the way we do time is a very new phenomenon. Okay, we're dealing with a time change this week. Some of y'all are probably still like half dead to the world because of the time change. Keeping time, and it's really a Western thing, because you go to other parts of the world. Like, I remember one of the first times I traveled outside the country, the joke was, you Americans have the watch and we have the time. People we were working with, because they're like, time doesn't make that big a deal. If they'll say they're going to be somewhere at 10 o'clock, well, they might be there at 9, they might be there at 2:30. And that was perfectly acceptable to them in their culture. So the way we keep time is very rigid. Other cultures don't. And the fact that we look at time very linearly, this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens. It's not always the way the ancient world saw it. Sometimes the ancient world saw things more in a cyclical pattern. Or I think the best way to look at it is it's a big fancy word called recapitulation. And here's the best way to understand it. If you've ever seen a really large diamond, it has facets where they cut it. Every time you turn that diamond, you see something a little differently. Okay? The diamond hasn't changed. It's still the same diamond, but you're seeing it differently. So much of what happens in the book of Revelation is not this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. It's here's what happened, and I'm telling you what I see here, and what I see here, and what I see here. It's all a lot of the same stuff, just from different perspectives. You understand time the way they understand it, you can read it and understand it that way. If you read and understand time the way we do, it's just a whole lot of people getting slaughtered, and pestilence, and famine, and plague, and bad stuff all the time. Okay? So just keep that in mind. And then, of course, the use of symbolic language. I've already mentioned that. So, And we'll go through this very quickly so we can get to Revelation 12 because it's such a good passage. Key questions to ask. 3 very quick ones. 1, would my interpretation have been reasonable to the original audience? We've already talked a little bit about that. I'm not going to go into more detail. But would it have been reasonable to them? Okay. Secondly, what are the important theological principles which transcend a specific interpretation? What I mean by that is this. You're going to find people who disagree on the book of Revelation. And they're still going to go to heaven when they die. Okay, this is not a salvation issue. But what you need to find out is what are the bigger principles at work, theologically speaking. Things like the sovereignty of God, the triumph of God over evil, God's protection of His people. Those theological principles that really transcend any view you may have of the book of Revelation. Okay? And then third, does my interpretation fit with the totality of the Bible? Use the Bible to interpret the Bible. Revelation is just one of 66 books. Read it with an eye toward the other 65. Okay, let what the other 65 say influence and inform how you read that one. Okay, so those questions are important. Now, Revelation 12 is what I would argue is one of, if not the most important chapter in the book of Revelation. And I want us to read it tonight. I'm going to read it to you. And as I read it, there's 4 questions I want you to answer as I read this passage. Okay? Here they are. Who is the woman? Who is the dragon? Who is the child? And what is the main theological emphasis of this passage? Okay? So those are the 4 questions, and then we're going to answer them, and we'll see how well you did on your little test. Okay? Okay. So, Revelation 12. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman, clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains in the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads 7 diadems or crowns. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to His throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. Now war arose in heaven. Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated. And there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now, the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of His Christ have come, for the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives even unto death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and seas, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness to the place where she is to be nourished for a time and times and half a time. The serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman to sweep her away with a flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. And the dragon became furious with the woman, and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. Y'all understand that passage perfectly, right? Who is the woman? That's the important. If you get that one right, the rest. Well, I'll give you the two easier ones. Who is the dragon? Okay, he tells us that one. Okay, that one's a gimme. Okay, Satan, the devil. Okay, who is the child? Jesus. Okay. So who is the woman?
Mary.
No. Israel. The people of God. Actually. Okay? The people of God. Think about it. See how the symbolism helps you here. Okay? A woman clothed with the sun, the moon, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. What does 12 typically reference? 12 tribes of Israel. So you see that reference even in that passage, that symbolism of 12. The woman is the people of God. You can say Israel, but the reason I don't want to make it people of God is because of what happens later in the passage. If you strictly make it Israel, you get some screwy interpretation. So it's the people of God is who it's actually a reference to. Okay? So what happens? What's going on in this passage? We know that. So here's what's going on. Okay, John is telling us this is what he's seeing. Now, if that's who these people are, is he seeing something that is happening in the future? He's seeing something that's already happened. So everything he's seeing is not always future, because that passage clearly is talking about something that's already happened. So here's what's going on. Okay, the people of God, Jesus comes through the line of Abraham. Okay, go all the way back to Genesis 12. God calls Abraham and says, "Through you, all the nations of the world will be blessed." So through Abraham, Jesus comes. Okay, Satan doesn't like it. So Satan tries to destroy Jesus. When does he try to do that?
Every chance he gets.
Every chance he gets. But there's really two main times he tries to get him in the wilderness with his temptation and the garden. Okay? Now if you remember the idea of a serpent from Genesis 3, when God curses the serpent, he says, "I'll put enmity between you and the offspring of the woman. You will strike his heel and he will stamp on your head." Okay? Promised very early in the passage of the Bible. So it says he was taken up to heaven to his throne. And then there's war in heaven. Okay? War in heaven. Michael and his angels fight against Satan and his angels. What's the result of that battle? Satan's kicked out of heaven. It's a little different than maybe some of what we've heard, right? Sometimes when you read the Bible, you get scratching your hair like, maybe what I've always been told isn't always the case. When was Satan kicked out of heaven?
In the beginning.
Is that what that passage says?
No, it says after he was in the wilderness.
It says after he tried to get the child, there was war in heaven. First time I read that, I'm like, why have I never seen this before? And I'm not saying this is a dogmatic interpretation, the only possibility, but here's what it seems like is happening. There are only two references, direct references to Satan in the Old Testament. Are you aware of those? One's in 1 Chronicles, when David does the census, and it says Satan enticed him to do a census. The other time, y'all know the other option is, or other occurrence of Satan in the Old Testament is? The book of Job. Where is Satan at in the book of Job? He's in God's heavenly court. Because he presents himself to God and says, I've gone to and fro upon the earth. So if you take a strictly linear perspective, it would seem as though Satan didn't get kicked out of heaven. I'm not making this a dogmatic statement. I'm just saying if you read the passage the way it's read, it seems as though he didn't get kicked out of heaven until he lost the battle. Did he lose the battle? When Jesus cried out on the cross, it is finished. Didn't Bill Gaither teach us that with the song Is Finished? If you don't know the song, you look it up later. It's a good song. I don't dislike it. Okay? Where was Satan thrown down to? Earth. Down to earth. So according to this passage, where is Satan working now? Here. Okay? We believe that, don't we? We believe that strongly. But you see the point here, I guess I'm trying to get with this passage, is we could read this and just read through it. And there's so much more here that we could go into, but the key theological emphasis, I think there's really 4 big principles that transcend the minute details of this passage. One is that God's plan will be accomplished. Satan will not triumph over God's plan. Okay? Second, God will protect and provide for His people. After this war in heaven, when Satan is cast down, the woman, the people of God, the church, goes into the wilderness, and God provides for His people in the wilderness. Some interpretations of that phrase, the 2 wings of the great eagle, to nourish her. Some interpreters argue, and I don't know if they're 100% right on this, that it's talking about the Old and the New Testament, and that the nourishment we get from the Bible to nourish us in the wilderness, in this period of time between Christ's first coming and Christ's second coming. So God will protect and provide for His people. Third, evil cannot win. Satan has already been defeated. Understand that. And then fourth, spiritual battles are real. Because there are demons around us. Okay, there are spiritual forces at war with us. I think sometimes we give the devil too much credit for stuff, and sometimes we don't give the devil enough credit. What I mean by that is sometimes we think the devil made us do everything that we do. Sometimes we do stuff just because we're stupid and make bad decisions. But other times we just completely disregard the spiritual role that Satan has in this world. I truly believe there are things that happen in this world because the devil does it. I don't deny that. Now, I'm not going to go around and say, that's the devil, that's not the devil, that's not my place, but to know that these are real things that are going on, and they will continue until Jesus comes back. That's why we pray, like at the end of the book of Revelation, come quickly, Lord Jesus. Because we see the world the way it is, and it ain't the way it ought to be. Okay? I hope this has kind of helped shed a little bit of light on the book of Revelation for you. Okay? And hope it's whet your appetite just a little bit. Alright, well, since I forgot that we need to take care of some slight business, we will go ahead and do that, and then we will dismiss.